Yeah, I forgot to mention, thanks for stopping me because I forgot to mention one thing. The Hudson Bay Company sold Rupert's land to Canada for £300,000. But they didn't sell all the land to Canada, they retained certain portions of the land, and they were tax exempt as a corporation. But also, the land that they retained for themselves, they've been selling over the years. So they've been retained, they didn't sell all the Rover's land to Canada. They retained some of that land themselves. They owe us money. The Hudson Bay Company had no right to sell any land that they did not own. So we have to go after them eventually too. You know what? Talking is over, okay? Action is needed here. The other thing I wanted to mention is this long-term reform that was negotiated by 3 organizations with the Crown. And it's not PSD are their lawyers doing it. Chiefs of Ontario office are their lawyers working on it. And the AFN are their lawyers, I don't know how many they had working on it. Now that's a flawed process. That's a flawed process. And this, no region, Alberta, Manitoba, or Saskatchewan, has the right to negotiate with the Crown for the rest of the country without their participation. Because each of our First Nations, the way they organize themselves, are unique and distinct. The way child welfare works in Manitoba is very different than the way it works here. And I know that because I was involved in negotiating the agreement to establish child welfare agencies back in the day, in the 1980s, I think, I forget the exact time. And our intention was to take the power away from white agencies to prevent more apprehensions and custody in cities like that. It didn't work. We failed that time. But now they're talking about long-term reform. Look at it this way. Last year they spent $3.3 billion on child welfare across the country. $3.3 billion. Multiply that by 10. That's $33 billion. Because the next 10 years they still have to do this, right? And then the agreement that we're being told is all new money is $47 billion something. So my question is, how much of that is new money? Because if you look at the way of the increase in spending in the last few years, there was a big jump in the last year. A great big jump. And what the agreement will do is it'll create a plateau for 10 years. So we have to question, is it addressing the needs? You as leaders, as chiefs, whether you're Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or Alberta, you cannot tweak this agreement. You have to convince yourself that the money is adequate to meet the needs of your children and families, period. That should be the only consideration. This is my view. And I don't hold my views back. Unlike you. So they're talking about long-term reform. But there's nothing there about jurisdiction over children. And in fact, any provisions about Indigenous laws or First Nations laws, if you see the provision, you have to raise the question, why are they distinguishing First Nations who make their laws over children, that the agreement doesn't apply to them, but they would get some money as well. they would get money as well. I got 5 minutes. All right. That's more than most people give me. And the agreement says that when it comes to calculating funds, that will be centralized. That process will be centralized. In other words, the three parties to the agreement and the federal government will be the ones who are making that decision. Now, the federal government has a fiduciary responsibility for us, apparently. But my view is that no political organization should ever negotiate a national agreement without the consent of all the other regions. Therefore, my advice in Manitoba to the chiefs is negotiate your own arrangement. Negotiate your own, because you can then deal with the reality of your communities and the needs of the children and families. And you will not do it in the way it was done, in a secret way, with non-disclosure, with no one ever finding out what's actually going on. That process was flawed. Our people have the right to know what is being negotiated for them. No one should hold that in secret. Well, I guess I'm getting carried away again. So that's my view on that. And yeah, you can feel the heat. I just wanted to say, this movement that we started is going to go places. And because the grassroots, the people themselves, they want something concrete, some results. But my advice, as a former spokesperson for Phase 1 to 11, is when we meet in Winnipeg, the coming meeting in Winnipeg for the long-term agreement, long-term reform, let's have a meeting with the treaty group there, all the treaty chiefs. And we can talk about this idea of how we want to organize, like what structure we want. That kind of thing can be discussed there. We don't have to do it here today. You know what I'm saying? Because there we'll have a greater representation of the leadership. And this whole process started with the chiefs. So most of them will be there, I think, in Winnipeg. And we can have a side meeting on how we're going to structure our Treaty 1 to 11 as a group, and how we're going to move forward on that front. Final comment, why I say that long-term agreement that is being proposed right now is not about long-term reform. Because one of the requirements when it comes to allocating funds is to use the Indian Act definition of who is an Indian and who is not an Indian. And we know that many of the children, 6-2 children, are not listed. And they will not have any services. So therefore, even on that front, they didn't negotiate to change the citizenship work, because we are entitled to define our own citizenship. How can one region do that? It's not quite what King Charles did, but there's some similarities there. They were saying, "As mit now, go up mit now," so